Welcome to One Work, Five Questions with Donna Vitek and Dr. Mark Holowchak. Thank you for joining us today for this special occasion.
It is. Boy, somebody's birthday up there?
Yes, it is. Whose birthday is it? Is it Jeffy's birthday?
It could be my daughter's birthday, yeah.
Well,
He and I'm dog sitting. He and his little buddy have been misbehaving all day. So if there's some barking in the background, you'll know why.
Oh, that's okay. I'm sure Thomas Jefferson loved dogs.
No, he actually didn't.
He didn't?
One animal he didn't. It's not that he didn't like them. They would sometimes kill farm animals. So they'd be a nuisance. So.
Oh, the wolf in them. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, today we're celebrating Thomas Jefferson's birthday. I'm so excited. So we have a little different spin on our show today. It's going to be One Man, Five Stories. And the episode with James Madison we'll do next week. We just move things around a little bit.
Yeah, and you know what they're doing at Monticello and at Charlottesville? They're celebrating galore Jefferson's birthday. They don't do that anymore.
Oh, wow.
City Council since 2019, I think it was, decided that they're celebrating Liberation Day or something when the Civil War, the Southern forces in Charlottesville surrendered formally to the Northern and freed Black people. They're using Jefferson's birthday for that. They've decided pretty much unanimously that you can't celebrate a racist birthday. So these are the people in Charlottesville City Council. These are members that they're not members of the council now, but they're deciding all this for us, right? That we can't celebrate Jefferson's birthday. He hasn't done anything for me.
That's too bad. Well, we are celebrating Thomas Jefferson's birthday.
We will be,
so
yes.
I'm grateful for his contributions to giving us what we have today. The freedom and liberty, the freedom of religion and freedom of speech, and I want to celebrate that. So but first, not without your credentials. Okay, so this is Dr. Holowchak. Dun, 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 dun. You like my Brady Bunch? Dun, 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 dun. Here's the story.
I didn't know what you're doing.
Oh, that's right.
I didn't watch the Brady Bunch.
You were probably an adult by the time the Brady Bunch came.
I was old enough to be the father's grandfather at the time, so I didn't really watch it.
Oh, okay.
I was watching the Jack Benny show.
Oh, okay. So Dr. Holowchak is a professor of philosophy and history, the two best combinations for a historian, because he understands language, he understands the study that the people who made our great country, who put together our great country, their influencers, the people who influence them. So Dr. Holowchak is very well-rounded. He's taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University, Camden, Ohio, and Ohio University. He's the editor of the Journal of Thomas Jefferson and His Time, and he has authored, numerous, 23 books, I think we're at, or maybe more now.
24, I think.
24.
A lot.
Okay, and we still have the historical fiction that's yet to be.
Few books yet that aren't published.
Yeah. So he's got a few in the wing waiting to come out. So and close to or over 200 essays now on Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, a lot.
Okay, and I highly recommend if you look in the comments of or the description of the video, you'll find where you can locate Dr. Holowchak's essays, and I highly recommend reading them. You'll become a better writer for it. Okay, that's his credentials. With our show One Work, Five Questions, I asked Dr. Holowchak 5 questions on one work of Thomas Jefferson, but today we're doing One Man, Five Stories. So this is going to be quite an educational topic for any of you writing a paper on Thomas.
I don't know if it's going to be educational. This is going to be fun.
It's going to be educational and fun. Those can coexist, right? Educational and fun.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So our introduction to today's celebration of Thomas Jefferson's birthday. It is our 43rd episode. Wow. That's amazing. It's our 43rd episode of One Work, Five Questions. And this show was designed to take viewers into the recesses of the mind of Thomas Jefferson by looking at careful and critical, and by making a careful and critical analysis of the works of Thomas Jefferson, one work at one time. We have for you a very special episode for today. Since today is Jefferson's birthday, and coincidentally, haha, I don't believe in coincidences, this is the 43rd episode, and Thomas Jefferson was born in 1743.
I'm gonna rush right out, play the number 43 in the lottery. I'll probably spent about $10,000 on that.
Oh, wait, I'm glad you said that.
Oh gosh, let's not talk.
You know what? If you can buy beer, I can buy lottery tickets.
You're wasting your money. I'm not.
I beg to differ, but I stand to gain much more if I win than you do.
I disagree with that wholeheartedly. I'm buying happiness. You're buying money.
One beer at a time. Okay, with today being Thomas Jefferson's birthday, we've decided to do something different. Dr. Holowchak will share with us 5 stories about Thomas Jefferson that, to his thinking, tell us much about the man and his mind, which is very important to understand with Thomas Jefferson, especially in today's culture, cancel culture. You really need to know how he thinks in order to weed through the rubble of today. Was he really such a villainous rogue and Janus-headed figure as the ultra-federalists of his day painted him? Was he such a hypocrite and racist as modern scholars paint him? So that's going to be for you to decide. And we're hoping by listening to the show and listening to the information we're giving you, that you can make that educated decision for yourself, what you think about Thomas Jefferson, instead of being influenced by the media or by people who don't have good intentions. So I am Donna Vitek, and this is One Word, One Man, 5 Stories today. Right. Yes. Okay, so now we have an introductory question, and we have 5 questions. So I get 6
questions.
There's a way of working 6 more questions in, isn't there? Okay, I begin with an introductory question, not one of 5. So you'll still have your 5 questions. Biographer Henry Adams said of Jefferson, "A few broad strokes of the brush would paint the portraits of all the early presidents with this exception, and a few more strokes would answer for any member of their many cabinets. But Jefferson could be painted only touch by touch with a fine pencil, and the perfection of the likeness depended upon the shifting of an uncertain flicker of its semi-transparent shadows." What did Adams mean?
Yeah, that's a quote that many biographers use when writing a biography of Jefferson. And basically, it's some sort of articulation of the difficulty of doing Jefferson scholarship, because Jefferson, when the first Journal of Thomas Jefferson and His Time came out, which is a different journal that I was working on, I wrote the introductory essay, and I actually included that quote in. The idea is that, you know, when you write a biography of some, say, founding father, it's not such a difficult task as it is when you choose Thomas Jefferson, because as we discussed before, Jefferson's interests were so broad, and even though he was so broadly interested in things, the things with which he was involved deeply. So he was a meteorologist, he was a farmer, he was a religionist, he was a lawyer, he was a politician, he was a moralist, he was a scientist, all things considered, architect, gardener. So to really understand the person, one has to be, in some measure, all those things as well.
Oh, and you forgot the 2 most important.
Which one?
A husband and a father.
Yeah, well, one could question whether he was such a, to what extent was he a great father and husband. Um, he was those things, but he was, imagine trying to be a husband and father while you're so involved politically. One could question whether he really was a great husband or father. Um, I don't know enough to say that. It'd be an interesting show to do, simply because he was so involved in the revolution at the time.
Right, right.
Yeah. But
Well,
anyways, the idea is by Henry Adams is saying it's difficult, you to involve yourself with Jefferson is like being a connoisseur of fine beers or fine wines or something like fine foods. You need to know everything about food before you profess to pass a judgment on the beef stroganoff or on the imperial stout or something like that. And so the idea is that, and I've said this often, is that no one should attempt to be a Jefferson scholar unless you know Greek and Latin, unless you know something about the history of science and history of philosophy, unless you know other modern languages to some extent, and unless you know the political thinking of the ancients and of the moderns, as well as the moral thinking of the ancients and moderns. So you have to be a pretty deep and wide scholar yourself to attempt to do. And I'm not trying to pat myself on the back for this by saying that. I'm just making I think, a descriptively accurate claim.
right,
Scholars approaching
right,
Jefferson have to be well-rounded and pretty deep.
right, right.
Otherwise, there's going to be a sort of transparency there. I mean, you're not going to fool anybody, the people who really know Jefferson. But
I
that
can tell
said,
you, I can tell you as a in graduate school, I could tell the people who, that's why I sought, I had to find you when I read your work, because I could tell you knew him at a deeper level just by your writing. You understood him at a much deeper level than the other authors' work I was reading. It was very superficial.
so why do you think people talk about his hypocrisy and racism today? Because they can't meet the challenge of doing great biography.
Right.
Peter Ona, for example, let's just call, Annette Gordon Reed, and I'm not trying to be pejorative. Let's just talk about his racism and his hypocrisy, right? Because, well, it's an awfully difficult challenge to talk about him as a meteorologist or as a paleontologist or as, a moralist, of his religious views, his architectural views. That requires have to do a lot of reading, a lot of research. So that's what I mean by that, by your introductory question.
Okay, wonderful. I have to
That's
stop
what
shaking my head. The doctor said no movements. I with my eye.
those screws might get loose, right?
They're
I have
already loose. I
I have
don't
the
even think I
same
have
I
any.
have the same problem, so don't feel bad.
I know aging is the pits. Okay, so story one. I'm so excited. I woke up thinking about this today, and wishing him a happy birthday. Story one is about Thomas Jefferson as a lawyer. Ooh, here we ask, was Thomas Jefferson a good lawyer?
Well, these questions we've shared in advance, obviously, because I have to do some research here, and I'm looking at the domestic life of Thomas Jefferson by Sarah N. Randolph, one of his granddaughters, who wrote, in some sense, a biography of Jefferson. And so part of what we're doing here to celebrate Jefferson's birthday is sharing some of my favorite stories about Thomas Jefferson. Now, asking me to pick out my five favorites, impossible. I told you already there are two that are in my top five favorite that I didn't share because they're fairly lengthy, and we can talk about it another time.
Okay.
One of which the reception that he got when he came back as Secretary of State, and another was um, the story about Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and James Monroe meeting Lafayette at when Lafayette toured. Lafayette was a general in the French, French general in the American Revolution, and the French helped the Americans greatly and loved Jefferson, had a correspondence, and he toured America later in life prior to
Okay.
Jefferson dying. But I didn't include that. But anyway, this one I can answer somewhat briefly. It's she writes, Sarah writes, her brother, Mr. Jefferson Randolph, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, um, He was anxious to learn how his grandfather has stood as a pleader, in other words, as a lawyer. Mr. Randolph once asked an old man of good sense who in his youth had often heard Jefferson deliver arguments in court, how he ranked as a speaker. So in other words, his grandson, and he loved his grandson, says, how was my grandfather as a lawyer? Was he a good lawyer? And the person who knew Thomas Jefferson as a lawyer replied rather briefly, well, it's hard to tell because he always took the right side. Right. That says, to me, it says almost everything about Jefferson. When he took a case, he took a case. We talked about before how he helped 5 people who were Black or partly Black try to win their freedom. He didn't charge any of these people money. He never took a case, presumably, if we follow this, unless he believed the person was in the right or innocent. And, obviously that means you're not probably going to be a highly successful lawyer, even though Jefferson presumably had close to 1,000 cases, if you look at his docket books that he undertook in his years as a lawyer from 1767 to 1774, when he says he stopped doing. So
Wow.
he was acknowledged to be a highly successful lawyer, but he was not, as I've said in one of my own talks, eminently cut out for the law, because he didn't have a booming voice or large presence, and he was not inclined to prevaricate, to lie.
Right.
He always, as he said here, he always took the right side. I think that's pretty cool.
And that tells a lot about his moral character. Because I've often said my family used to tell me when I was younger that I should have been a lawyer, and
glad you're
something.
not.
Well, I couldn't if somebody was actually guilty, I could never defend a guilty person. So yeah, I wouldn't have been successful with it.
Well, for a lot of people, it's about the money, right?
Yeah.
I can defend a guilty person if there's a lot of money to be made, or if I can make a name for myself.
I have to sleep at night, so. Oh, and let me know when we're ready to show some of the pictures too, when you'd like for me to put the pictures
Okay.
up. Okay, question number 2, story 2 is about Thomas Jefferson's diverse interest in so many vital things. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, this takes us to story 2. This is one of my top 5 favorites. Maybe my favorite of all. I don't know. Jefferson was en route from Monticello to Poplar Forest, and he stops off at Ford's Tavern to spend the night to get something to eat. He there sits down next to someone who happened to be a preacher, and Jefferson engages in conversation. Now, Jefferson doesn't tell the person who he is. Now, they start talking about mechanics, and the person acknowledges, boy, this guy knows a lot about mechanics. He's certainly an engineer. The conversation turns to farming, to agriculture. And then the preacher shakes his head and says, well, he's not an engineer. He's obviously a very prominent farmer, knows everything about farming. Then the conversation turned to religious matters. And the preacher thinks to himself, well, this man is neither mechanic nor farmer. He's a fellow preacher. And the next day, the preacher goes to the owner of the tavern and says, well, who was this person with whom I dined? And he says, well, you didn't know? That was none other than Thomas Jefferson. And the guy says, the preacher says, I tell you, that was neither an atheist nor irreligious man, one of juster sentiments I never met with. Now, why do I like this? Not because of that last line that was delivered, but because Jefferson sat down with this person. He could have tried to sit down by himself in some corner. He doesn't. He sits down. I don't know how crowded the tavern was, but he sits down next to someone. He engages in conversation. The first thing you can say is, hi, my name's Thomas Jefferson. Let's talk. Right? What would that have done? That would have put the other person on the defensive. The other person would have sat down and says, oh my goodness, this was President Jefferson. He's talking to me. and the person wouldn't have opened up. He would have been
Right,
defensive. He doesn't do that.
right.
So then just talk about, then secondly, he just wants casual conversation with someone while he's dining.
Well,
How
this was
about
a
that?
very modest man. Didn't he walk to his inauguration?
Yes, yes,
So
yes.
yeah, so he was a very modest. I could see why he wouldn't have had to name drop.
Yeah, real quickly, there was another story. I'll throw in a quick one. I can do this in a minute or so, where he's on his horse as president. He's out in Washington for a ride. As he's coming back, he meets someone on foot who starts talking about the president. He can't stand Thomas Jefferson. He starts, oh, Jefferson so and so. And the guy says, well, and Jefferson says, well, why do you speak so contemptuously of our president? If you have you ever met him? He goes, no. Why do you speak so contemptuously? He goes, well, because X, Y, and Z is this type of person. He goes, hmm. He goes, well, I happen to know him. He says, if you come to his place of residence at so and so at such and such time on the following day, I will introduce you. And the man thinks, he goes, all right, I'll take you up on that. So he goes to the door, and as he shows up at the required time, Jefferson greets them, and the man is sort of red-faced, thinking, I was what? And the man becomes a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, and he loved Jefferson thereafter, after that. So he comes in to dine with him.
Oh, I love that story. That's the first I've heard about. I'll need to
Cute
get more
story.
I'll need to get more details for our other project we're working on. That sounds like something that would make a good topic for our other project that you don't know about yet. But anyway, question number 3. Yeah, I'm going to be working you to death. Question number 3. Okay. Story 3 is about Thomas Jefferson and his love of birds.
Yes, he was an animal lover, like I said, with some qualification vis-a-vis his not so ardent love of dogs because they would, devastate sometimes his other farm animals. So if unchecked, but he loved birds. He loved mockingbirds. Um, when you look at the letters when he's in France, he goes to a very prominent uh, place where there is the ruins of Petrarch's village, of Petrarch's house up 200 feet up in the air, and a prominent river and so forth. And he's sitting there to rest, and he's in this beautiful area. And what he notices is the nightingale singing, and he talks in several letters he sends to his daughters who are in the convent in France. He says, "Have you ever noticed this bird? It sings quite beautifully. It's not quite up to our mockingbird." So he loved the Virginian mockingbirds.
Oh,
Mockingbirds are so called because they can imitate a large number of sounds. And Jefferson had a pet mockingbird named Dick, and even bought Dick a Serenet, which was a voice
oh
box
wow.
that had several sounds that it can make for the bird to imitate. Right? Who buys their pet bird a present? Right? He did. So Margaret Bayard Smith, and I'll read from my notes here. Her husband was a Federalist on the Federalist paper, and she writes upon meeting Thomas Jefferson and at what's the White House today. He says, in the window recesses, there were stands for the flowers and plants, which it was his delight to attend. And among his roses and geraniums was suspended the cage of his favorite mockingbird. Dick was his name. Now he's got flowers all over the place, right? He loves plants too, which he cherished with particular fondness, not only for its melodious powers, but for its uncommon intelligence and affectionate disposition, of which qualities he gave surprising instances. She's a fine writer too, you see. It was the constant companion of his solitary and studious hours. Whenever he was alone, he opened the cage and let the bird fly about the room. After flitting for a while from one object to another, it would alight on his table and regale him with its sweetest notes, or perch on his shoulder and take food from his lips. So he's got seeds that he's putting in his lips, so the bird takes the seeds. Often, when he retired to his chamber, it would hop up the stairs after him while he took his siesta, would sit on his couch and pour forth its melodious strains. How he loved this bird. Uh, this sounds like a really vicious, rapist, violent person, doesn't it? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what we get. Did at Monticello they have the placard that said, "Did Jefferson rape Sally Hemings?"
You're kidding.
It says that there. It's a question. Of course, that brings in people. Think of Jeff. Think of this person who was treating his mockingbird so gently, um, raping Sally Hemings, taking advantage. But that's what sells tickets to Monticello.
Right.
Why don't they tell these stories to balance things out? At least they don't. You don't get that at all. No one wants to hear about that. I get goosebumps when I hear stories like this about Jefferson, but we don't get these sort of stories. He loved his birds, and he loved music. He was a violinist, played the cello as well, a very fine violinist. But what it suggests is that when he stopped in nature, he appreciated, I think, the music of nature more than the music of man, because the music of nature was in part God's music.
Right.
God created these animals. And I hope I'm not exaggerating his love of God in that sense. It's not a God you'd pray to, but in just enjoying that, how could, this creator created these beautiful flying, singing animals that can imitate so many sounds. And why not appreciate that? And he did. He appreciated the music of nature, which got me. I gave a talk not long ago, last Monday, on Jefferson and music. I talked about his love of mockingbirds. And now that I have my windows and screens up, it's warm enough here. I can't help but listening to the mockingbirds in the morning, one perched on the wire, listening to the different sounds that the mockingbird can make. It's really a beautiful bird.
Wow. Oh, that's that. You know, uh, this the ideas are flowing. I'm sitting here taking notes while you're talking, just as I'm learning more, so I can do more research. And I want to get this information in as many different forms as I can out to the American people, so they can get to know their founder. That was my whole goal, and you have made it all come true.
Well, I think it's important to do this on his birthday to give
Yep.
people another side of the person. You only get the hypocrite, racist, bigot, and all that. And I don't think Jefferson was any of those things. That's what gets papers published and books published. That's what gets you on the cover of Smithsonian Magazine. If you want to talk about Jefferson's love of birds, you're not going to make it as a scholar, which
Yeah,
is in large part of the difficulty I have uh, with
right.
uh, with getting published. And so I don't have problems getting published, but published at University of Virginia and places like that.
Well,
Anyway,
they're missing out. Question 4. Story 4 is an episode related to Ellen Randolph Coolidge. This tells us about Thomas Jefferson as a father. Now it's time.
yeah, I picked out a passage here. Um, there's Ellen. Ellen was not the most beautiful. The granddaughters I picked, as far as I have pictures of them, very much looked like Thomas Jefferson. So they weren't essentially all that, handsome. But Ellen was really bright, like her grandfather, super high intelligence, and she was Jefferson's favorite. Whether you mention it or not, you can tell by reading the letters exchanged. He thought so much of her because she was highly intelligent. And Ellen grew up to be a little bit of a sort of snob herself, but it happens with people of higher intelligence. I like Ellen too. I just, anyway, she's writing when a certain biographer named Randall is writing a very early biography of Jefferson. I think it's 1856. I'm not sure, something
Okay.
like that. He talks of Thomas Jefferson's relationship to his daughter, right? Um, let's see. My mother was 10 years old, and Ellen's talking about her mother, Martha, Jefferson's oldest daughter. My mother
Okay.
was 10 years old when her mother died, when Thomas's,
There's
uh,
Martha Jefferson.
yeah, when Thomas's wife died. Her impression was that her father's conduct as a husband had been admirable in its ensemble. Admirable, I love that. Admirable in its ensemble, in its totality, charming in its detail. She distinctly recalled her mother's passionate attachment to him and her exalted opinion of him. In other words, Ellen's mother, Martha, loved her father very much. On one occasion, she heard her blaming him. So Martha, the daughter, heard Jefferson's wife blaming him for some generous act which had met with an ungrateful return. But she exclaimed, the mother, it was always so with him. He is so good himself that he cannot understand how bad other people may be. So his wife was sort of explaining when she reproaches Thomas Jefferson for not fully understanding someone else's comment with respect to Jefferson. Jefferson doesn't see the bad. The point is, Jefferson had a hard time seeing bad in other people because he wasn't bad. And I think that's sort of an interesting comment.
Right.
I'll read it again. On one occasion, my mother had been punished for some fault, daughter Martha, not harshly nor unjustly, but in a way to make an impression. Some little time later, her mother, Jefferson's wife, being displeased with her for some trifle, reminded her in a slightly taunting way of this painful past. She was deeply mortified. Her heart swelled, her eyes filled with tears. Jefferson's daughter, she turned away, but she heard her father say in a kind tone to her mother, his wife, my dear, a fault in so young a child, once punished, should be forgotten. So some evidence, small amount of evidence that Jefferson was a very, forgiving father, and maybe Martha, his wife, was a bit overbearing. That's it's hard to say that from that little bit there.
Okay. And we're almost out of time. We have about 7 minutes left. So let's do question number 5. Story 5 concerns the death of Thomas Jefferson as related by his grandson. And are we speaking of Thomas Jefferson Randolph, the grandson?
Yes, Jefferson loved his grandson so much. I can't explain that. His grandson loved him so much, and he did not share Jefferson's high intelligence.
How did Thomas Jefferson die?
Well, his doctor at the time was Douglason from the University of Virginia, and he goes to see him. And we get various accounts in the book, The Domestic Life, but for the most part, they generally square. Thomas Jefferson Randolph, his grandson, talks about how Douglason went to see him. So he comes and he's given the instructions, don't delay, there's no time to be lost. Jefferson was declining, but he would only have his servants sleeping near him, being disturbed only at 9, 12, and 4 o'clock in the night. He needed little nursing, so he was pretty much out of it. Becoming uneasy about him, I entered his room unobserved to pass the night. So his grandson comes to spend the night with the servants with Jefferson. Coming around inadvertently to assist him, he chided me, saying that being actively employed all day, I needed repose. On my replying that it was more agreeable to me to be with him, he acquiesced and did not leave him again. So his grandson he knows his grandfather is going to be passing away, and he wants to spend that time with him. Jefferson is moribund the day before the 4th of July. He wants to live to the 4th of July. He says his mother sat with him, his daughter Martha, during the day, but he would not permit her to sit up at night. He suffered no pain, but gradually sank from debility. His mind was always clear. It never wandered. He conversed freely and gave directions as to his private affairs. His manner was that of a person going on to a necessary journey, evincing neither satisfaction nor regret. He was a Stoic, in other words. He remarked upon the tendency of his mind to recur back to the senses of the Revolution. So upon dying, he's thinking back to the Great American Revolution. And so it cheered him to think of that. Okay, and one thing he says, Jefferson presumably says to his grandson, do not imagine for a moment that I feel the smallest solicitude about result. I'm like an old watch, in other words, about dying here, sorry. I'm like an old watch with a pinion worn out here and a wheel there until it can go on no longer. Now here we have, he was asked if he wanted laudanum to ease the pain, and Jefferson says, no, doctor, no more. A few more hours, doctor, and it'll be over. And then he was asked if the name of a certain preacher by the name of Mr. Hatch can come and see him. That's the minister of the church that Jefferson attended. Jefferson replied in the negative. In other words, no, he didn't want to see them, but then he changed his mind. He says, I have no objection to see him as a kind and good neighbor. In other words, he didn't want the preacher coming in, preaching him a sermon about the afterlife and the love of God and all that. But he says, if he wants to come in and say farewell to me as a neighbor, I love that. And it shows Jefferson, it said, was not religious. No, he's a profoundly religious person. His ideas of God were more lofty than most people's. It could not be imagined by most. People want a personalized God, one that you can access through prayer, one that has a nose and two eyes and a beard like me that makes you feel good. That wasn't Jefferson's God. And so he did not think that these preachers had any special access to God any more than he did or you and I do. He had no problem seeing this person as another human being, as a neighbor. So that's some of his thoughts before he died. And he died, on 4th of July.
Oh.
John Adams.
Yeah, I'm getting a little choked up because, the fact that he wanted to live to the 4th of July and remembering back to the American Revolution and all the sacrifices he made along with all of the other men in the continental.
Well, he certainly knew what a moment that would be, the 50-year anniversary that he died. Little did he know that John Adams would die shortly after him. Yeah. And that would make things really pretty cool. Everybody saw God in this, the hand of God, having these two people.
He's deserving of so much more respect than what he's given today. And that's
a shame, isn't it? It really is. And it makes me sick that we have so few great men and women in American history, and yet we have, and I pick on the progressives here, we have these people these ants that want to make a reputation of themselves by trying to destroy one of the great people in our history. And a good man, a very, very good man.
Yes. Oh, can you tell us a little bit? We have about 1 minute and 42 seconds left. Can you tell us a little bit about your book, The Cavernous Mind of Thomas Jefferson, an American Savant?
Yeah, I talk about the various hats that Jefferson wore in this book. It's published by Cambridge Scholars, and what it does is it talks about Jefferson as a farmer, as a lawyer, Jefferson as a religionist, as an epistolist, as a scientist, and so forth. And it's a fun read. I just thought, when I became editor of the journal, that something like this book needed to be written.
Oh, great. Wonderful. So that another book by Dr. Holowchak that is available for you. And quickly, we have 1 minute left. So I want to tell everybody, or I want you to tell everybody what they can look forward to next week.
Well, it's the one we were supposed to do this week till we had a change of mind. We decided to do something more in keeping with the celebration of his birthday, something optimistic and something in some sense to counter the nasty poison that's also spewed through the mouths of people these days about Jefferson. We're going to look at a letter from Jefferson to James Madison, where he talks about republicanism as an experiment. And he talks about different types of societies, right? And where Republican fits in these three different types of society.
Oh, wow. Oh, this should be a great letter. And that's the letter dated, for those of you who want to read ahead, it's January 30th, 1787, a letter to James Madison.
Okay. I think we're about done, huh?
Thank you. If you've enjoyed today, please like and share and subscribe to our channel.